Welcome to my backyard art gallery. To celebrate my 60th birthday on April the 18th, I set up a gallery of some of my watercolor paintings of local scenes and historic buildings. And I invited more than 60 people, and about 3/4 of them came. And we had a timed entry format so that we wouldn't ever have more than 10 in the backyard at once, from noon to 8 p.m. and so they could keep their distance as well. And each guest had a chance to donate to our denomination's Mennonite Church, British Columbia Indigenous Relations Fund, and take home a painting. The paintings have a story behind them, which I will narrate as we walk through the gallery. Many of them having to do with Indigenous history in the area. So let's go on a tour. From the middle of the river, this is a view of Golden Ears Bridge from the eastern end of Barnston Island, which is accessible only by ferry. Before Simon Fraser navigated the river and it got named after him, it did not have a name. The river was so dominant in the valley that it did not need a name and was just known as the river. And thus, the people who lived along the river were called the Stolo, or people of the river. Sacred gathering ground. The Hatzic Prairie Market is a few kilometers northeast of Hatzic Rock, which is a sacred gathering place and the oldest known human habitation in the Lower Mainland, dating back to at least 3,500 years. The irony is that the market is a present gathering place for locals, although perhaps more secular than sacred. It is rare to find a rural convenience store still in business. At the crossroads. This is at the corner of the Sumas Mission Highway and Old Claiborne Road. The quaint red shack that railroad workers would enter to switch the tracks has now been replaced by a silver box filled with technology. Cranberry fields forever. This is a view of a cranberry field on Barnston Island with Golden Ears Bridge in the background. The title is a variation on the Beatles' Strawberry Fields Forever, in case you forgot your rock and roll history. River floodplains from Chilliwack to Delta have been transformed into cranberry fields. Cranberries are one of the few native berries to North America, found in bogs and various places, although not specifically in this area. The middle of Sumas Lake, one and two different perspectives. Most people who drive by on the Trans-Canada Highway do not realize they are driving on the northern shore of what used to be a large, shallow lake. Even the sign at a rest stop only celebrates the engineering feat of the 1920s and not the much longer history. The lake was the lifeblood of Indigenous people for millennia before contact with European explorers, gold speculators, and settlers. The lake contained more than a dozen kinds of fish, including varieties of salmon and the mighty sturgeon. The area around the lake was home to hundreds of varieties of plants, trees, birds, amphibians, reptiles, and mammals. It was as rich as a lake as it is now of agriculture. The middle of the lake would have varied with the seasons, but this bright red barn could be close. It not only contrasts the dark backdrop of Vedder Ridge in behind it, but also demonstrates the contrast between the former lake and the present agricultural industry. The end of Sumas Lake. The Barrowtown Pumping Station, built in 1928, regulates the rivers and canals that drain Sumas Lake. Numerous streams fed the lake, and the Sumas River connected it to the river that eventually flowed out to the Salish Sea. I was deeply impacted by my reading of the book Before We Lost the Lake by Chad Reimer. It tells the story of Sumas Lake from ancient times until it was drained and turned into the rich farmland we see today. The house at a lumber mill built by a lake. Trethewey House, circa 1920s, as it is commonly called, was the home of the Trethewey family that operated a lumber mill on the shores of this small lake that came to be named after the economy. Mill Lake. Most of the present city of Abbotsford was a rich, temperate rainforest that provided timber for growing settlements of newcomers. The most beautiful piece of art ever by a divine artist. I just cut and shaped a broken mirror and made the frame. Looking in the mirror every morning is a daily ritual for most of us, but we don't always recognize what we are looking at. Every human being is created in the image of a God who is love, and is therefore a beloved child of God. The beginning of spiritual formation is to recognize this, which is why it is at the core of my teaching at Columbia Bible College. The mission on the hill. The present Westminster Abbey overlooks a beautiful valley to the south and the east from the vantage point from which this is painted. In the valley, what used to be St. Mary's Mission and Residential School, as well as Hatzig Rock. The bell tolls for the victims of St. Mary's. In the foreground is the band shell of Heritage Park and Mission that hosts the Mission Folk Festival and weekly concerts in the summer. In the background, to the left, is the bell from St. Mary's Residential School, which operated closer to the river beginning in 1863, on this very site from 1882 to 1965, and at another site nearby to the east until 1985. The story of the residential school needs to be brought into the foreground. Indigenous children were taken away from their parents in order to be Christianized and Canadianized at residential schools spread across the new country of Canada. Many experienced abuse and even death at these schools. Sikhs were here before Mennonites. This is Gur Sikh Temple in Abbotsford. It is interesting to note that these two previously persecuted minority religious groups from separate continents have both come to have a prominent place in the city of Abbotsford. The Sikhs came here to this area in 1905, started plans for this temple in 1908, and completed it in 1911. Mennonites first came to this area in 1927, and the first church was established in Abbotsford in 1931. The glory days are gone. Granny and Grumpa's used to be BC's largest antique emporium, filling multiple large buildings with everything from the tiniest knickknacks to large machines and tractors. This picture is the way it was in the last summer of its existence. Since then, many of the items have been auctioned off and Granny and Grumpa have moved on. The last I heard was that the new owners are still trying to keep the idea alive, but it just is not the same without the personalities and the endless mess that made a visit memorable. The place to be on a hot summer day. Birchwood Dairy on Sumas Prairie. Nothing beats ice cream right from the farm where the cows live and produce. Rail for the Valley. This used to be one of the stations of an electric train service from Chilliwack to New Westminster. Much of the infrastructure for the railroad is still available to be revitalized and is sorely needed in the valley as an alternative to the congestion and pollution of the Trans-Canada Highway. Check out the website www.railforthevalley.com if you're interested in this project. Window shopping is not possible in the Claiborne General Store. This painting is of one of the front windows of Claiborne General Store. The store used to serve the company town built around the Claiborne Brickworks, but it is now an old-fashioned candy store and tea house. I painted the 4 pictures as a set, knowing in my mind exactly the kind of frame I needed. But it took me many months to find one that was appropriate, and even then it had to be reshaped and sanded and painted. Place of refuge. This is one of the small buildings that comprise the Hermitage at Camp Squia, between Hope and Yale, just off the Trans-Canada Highway. Squia means place of refuge in the local Salish dialect. The camp faces a mountain to the east of it by the same name. The Hermitage was built in the 1970s by Clarence Bauman, who was one of a rare breed of Mennonite mystics. It has since fallen into disrepair, perhaps waiting for a revival of Mennonite mysticism. The state of the salmon fishery. This former salmon shack sits on the dike between the town of Ladner and the south arm of the river. Perhaps it is a commentary on the vanishing stocks of wild salmon. Due to pollution, overfishing, salmon farms, and the encroachment of urban and industrial development. Unceded territory. Much of British Columbia is unceded territory in that no treaty was ever signed between settlers and Indigenous people, as it was on the other side of the mountains. In that light, I found it ironic that someone seems to think they have exclusive rights to this property and to keep everybody else out due to an economic transaction and a title in some government office. And yet, it's only a short distance away from the site of an ancient settlement of Indigenous people who were forced off the land so Europeans could divide it up and make private property of it and say, keep out. Dancing in the forest. Straighten Hall is a quaint venue up on the shoulder of Sumas Mountain for weddings, family gatherings, or other celebrations. It is named for Thomas Straighten, who settled here in 1893. The community used to have its own school, store, and post office because it was so isolated from the more developed towns on the lowlands. Little White Church in the Vale, Matsqui Evangelical Lutheran Church. Does anyone remember the old gospel song? No spot is so dear to my childhood as the little brown church in the vale. Oh, come to the church in the wildwood, come to the church in the dale. There are only a few of these rural churches left, but Abbotsford does include a couple of them if you know where to look. Surveying the valley. This is the Turner House, the way it looked before it was moved to its present location in Claiborne Village in preparation for restoration. It was the home of George Turner, who surveyed the land which was to become Abbotsford for the British Royal Engineers. Dividing land into square section township range system without consideration for geography and topography really makes no sense in British Columbia, especially if you believe that the Creator owns it all anyway, and people are really here to share it and look after it. The pier at Pequalls, or White Rock. Although the rock has been painted white many times to cover graffiti, Mother Nature did paint it white in the first place. It is a glacial deposit whose presence on the shore of the Salish Sea has a story of romance and intrigue that explains how it got there. Thanks for coming to the Backyard Art Gallery.